Thank you. I just want to acknowledge we have one of the authors of the first paper that I'll be presenting, one of the Pittsburgh papers, Dr. Ezoo, who's now an assistant professor in the University of Florida Medical School, so he's back there, and several of my other co-authors that have worked with me on numerous projects are also here, so I just wanted to acknowledge them. And these are just the collaborators that made really this research, these four papers. And I want to say I thought we had three papers for Phil that were on Pittsburgh, and then it turned out a fourth paper emerged that really just got accepted. So I had to squeeze that paper in there too, because I think it's important to talk about the U.S., talk about Pennsylvania, but obviously talking about Pittsburgh really does bring it home and brings home what is really going on here in our locale. So our objectives for today, I'm going to define, many of you know a lot of this, but define adverse birth outcomes, air pollution exposures, which we went over in the morning, and biological mechanisms for how some of these health effects can occur as a result of air pollution. Present some results of very early. It's always nice to kind of see how the early studies started and what hunches they went on early on as trailblazers. An overview of literature related to air pollution and birth outcomes, and then again present studies specific to Pittsburgh. And I think just to say it now, because I'll be repeating it again, I believe that air pollution at both national and local levels, as will be described in this presentation, has a significant impact on the risk of adverse birth outcomes. And I hope to show you or convince you or to let you see some of that evidence. These outcomes are associated with ambient air pollution levels currently that are still seen in Pittsburgh and in the U.S. First, obviously, you've got to know what you're studying, what are you talking about here. The issue is, first of all, preterm birth, which is defined by the definition of a baby that is born with less than 37 completed weeks of gestation, where the average would be between 40 and even up to 44. This is less than 37 completed weeks of gestation is considered a preterm birth. Low birth weight. You've heard of low birth weight, and that is less than 2,500 grams or 5.5 pounds. And then there's also another definition called IUGR, intrauterine growth retardation, which basically means a restriction, which means small for gestational age. Even though they've reached a certain gestational age, they're less than the 10th percentile for weight of all babies at that gestational age. Oh, this is quick, sorry. We talk about, so what? How does this really count toward a burden of disease in our culture and our society? Low birth weight is a leading cause of neonatal mortality. That's death before 28 days of age. Low birth weight infants are more likely to experience physical and developmental health problems or die during the first year of life than infants who are of a normal weight. In 2009, about 8% of U.S. infants were born in the low birth weight category. In 2006, the rate of low birth weight was actually the highest recorded in 4 decades, or 8.3%. Again, in 2009, the rate of low birth rate was much higher among infants born to African American women, generally about 13.6%, compared to 7.2% in Caucasians. And just to give you an example of where we stand in Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, and the U.S., you can see that, again, among Caucasians, the rate is around 7% currently, 7.2%. African American across the board, but even more so in Allegheny County, the low birth weight rate is around 13.5%, pushing 14%. And the Healthy People 2010 goal is actually 5%. So we're certainly below the goal across the board for Healthy People 2010. If you've worked in the area of pediatrics and obstetrics, It's very well known that there are some very significant risk factors for preterm birth and low birth weight, and they are age of the mother, with very young mothers and very old mothers having a greater risk. Race, we've already mentioned. Parity, number of children. Obviously, previous preterm birth because of what could be going on genetically. Prenatal care after the first trimester. It's very important for a mother to seek prenatal care early. That's an important tracker for having a good outcome. Pre-existing diabetes, infections. One of the number one risk factors for preterm and low birth weight are smoking during pregnancy, and then of course multiple births. So having defined outcomes, we now should move on to exposures. What are we talking about when we refer to ambient air pollution? And I believe Luann mentioned this earlier this morning. In this presentation, I'll be speaking largely about the 6 principal pollutants called the criteria pollutants, which are particulate matter, either PM10, which is a larger particle, PM2.5, which is smaller, and then there's something called total suspended particulates, which is really, this is a term that was used prior to the PM10, PM2.5 reading in the air pollution literature, and is still referred to somewhat today. We're also talking about ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and lead. As far as mechanisms, we were talking about mechanisms this morning about how can, for instance, particulates lead to prematurity, how can they lead to low birth weight, and it's really a similar story. It affects particles that are breathed into your system and then taken up by your body, affect blood viscosity, the so-called blood clotting that Dr. Schwartz was talking about. Your blood becomes thicker, it's more viscous, it's more difficult to go through your body and to really do the job it needs to do of oxygenation. So it affects maternal placental blood flow, transplacental oxygen and nutrient transport, and you can see how that could lead to intrauterine growth retardation, but also ultimately to prematurity and low birth weight. And then all the way down to so-called inflammatory markers that we were talking about earlier today too, with just inflammation. When you're breathing in particles and your body knows that isn't a normal part of what should be in the air, it responds by affecting negatively, and that really increases the inflammation all throughout your system, and that can also lead to difficulty with the baby and difficulty with development. So those are the 2 of the primary possible biological mechanisms for premature birth and also for low birth weight. So the first question is, when did we first begin to think that ambient air pollution was a risk factor for birth outcomes? And there probably were even earlier studies than this one, but the one that impressed me, probably one of the studies that impressed me the most, was this study by Williams in 1977 of the Los Angeles basin. The hypothesis was that, based on the finding that women, this was found previously by another researcher in 1972, that women who smoked a pack of cigarettes a day or more had babies that were between 100 and 300 grams less than non-smoking mothers. And so Williams basically put forward the hypothesis that if smoking a pack of cigarettes a day can do that, breathing particles, breathing particulates, or breathing air pollution essentially 24/7, if you're living in a polluted area, that might have a very similar effect. So she set out to take a systematic sample of 1,500 women who delivered in 1973 and basically assigned exposure to light, moderate, or high air pollution levels based on the residence of birth and where the woman was residing at that time. She looked at average readings, and actually, to her credit, for 1977, when, let's face it, computers were not nearly as powerful as they are now, and as I remember, mainframes were probably the course of the day for people doing work with large data sets. She was able to accumulate exposures not just for one particular point in time, but she actually looked over time at trimesters. She looked at the first the first trimester, the second and third, and actually came up with an average reading for each woman. Here's just an example of what the Los Angeles basin looked circa 1960s. I remembered I was out in Los Angeles jogging down Colorado Avenue in the early 70s. My sister lived out there. She had, was a nurse in UCLA Medical Center. And I remembered I remember jogging and thinking I was being so good. I was jogging down Colorado Avenue, and I suddenly realized that the back of my throat burned. My chest burned. I thought, wow, what is this? And then, of course, as I learned more and more about air pollution in the late 60s and early 70s, I realized that it was probably a combination of ozone, SO2, PM10. And so I just remembered it being that bad. And of course, it's better now, better than it was. But of course, Los Angeles is still a very, also a very polluted area. And of course, people became up in arms about it, and not only in Pittsburgh but also out west, started to demand that something be done about it. But Williams, getting back to Williams, she looked at carbon monoxide, NO2, ozone, all the pollutants that were monitored. These generally coexist with particulates. Now, she didn't actually use particulates in the analysis. She had all the other pollutants, but we know the particulates, where you have high CO, high NO2, and high ozone, you also have high TSP and high particulates. So these women were stratified also by smoking history. And what she found was among non-smoking women, birth weight difference between heavy and light pollution areas was almost 300 grams. So this was almost the same as smoking 1 pack of cigarettes a day after adjusting for parity, education, and all the other risk factors that we had mentioned earlier. So this was one of the early studies. This was followed by another study that actually took place in Beijing by another Ezoo in 1995, who looked at women who were registered at OB-GYN hospitals from early pregnancy until delivery in 1988. He registered he looked at total suspended particulates in SO2 and temperature, which were recorded daily, and found that levels of these pollutants in China in '88 were quite high. We know they're high now, but they were quite high then as well. And with SO2s in the 100 microgram range and TSP approaching 400. Significant dose response, significant dose-dependent association was noted between gestational age, SO2, and TSP. Adjusted odds for preterm delivery was 1.10, which is 10% higher for every 100 micrograms of TSP. TSP, PM10 and 2.5 are a subset of TSP. Depending on whether it's motor vehicle or industry, it can be anywhere from 40 to 50% of what you would find. It would be 40 to 50% higher for TSP. You'd be essentially halving it to about 35 or 40 micrograms of PM10 or PM2.5, depending again on whether it's industrial or motor vehicle. And the interesting thing about this study, and the reason I like to mention it as being an early study, is that this is actually the curve for high pollution days and gestation, high pollution versus low pollution, and looking at gestational age in weeks by frequency of when the baby was born. And you can see, sort of similar to the London fog episode where you saw smoke and then you saw deaths in a similar pattern, the high pollution days were definitely more skewed to the left, which is, again, further evidence of a dose-dependent relationship. So in addition to these two early studies, there have been recently a very significant systematic meta-analysis conducted by Steve et al. That was published last year. He reviewed 62 studies on the association of air pollution and low birth weight. All the studies that occurred that had significant sample size power and were robust enough to really report on from 1980 to 2011. And his synopsis was that most studies reported reduced birth weight and increased odds of low birth weight in relationship to exposure to carbon monoxide, NO2, PM2.5, and PM10. And he reported that there would be a pooled estimate of a decrease in birth rate ranging from 11.4 grams for every 1 parts per million of carbon monoxide to 28.1 grams for every 20 parts per billion of NO2. He just went on to say that he saw fairly robust and fairly common findings related to these particular pollutants, and as well as for PM10 and PM2.5. Results were less consistent for ozone and SO2. Here's just an example of a meta-analysis. He took all the studies that were done by trimester 1, trimester 2, trimester 3, and then when they looked at the entire pregnancy. And here is where you would find no effect of birth weight. And all the lines to the left show change in birth weight per 20 grams increase in PM10. And you can see, particularly in the 3rd trimester and for the entire pregnancy, most of the studies do not really overlap the 0 effect, but are skewed to the left, implying that there was a consistent effect of lowered birth weight per increase in PM10. And this also held up for PM2.5. So getting back to Allegheny County, we're talking about sources of pollution in Allegheny County, and I think it bears repeating that ozone is formed in hot, sunny locations from vehicle, commercial, industrial emissions. Particulate matter generally comes from coke plants, steel mills, power plants, road dust, and vehicles. SO2 is primarily from power plants and coke ovens, being more coal combustion based. Carbon dioxide is motor vehicles, and NO2, so-called nitrogen dioxide, again from power plants, industrial plants, and motor vehicles. The first study that was done related to Pittsburgh and Allegheny County was a study done by Ezoo, who's in the audience, and Ravi Sharma and my colleagues. And he looked at PM10 air pollution exposure during pregnancy and term low birth weight in Allegheny County. And again, in the Allegheny County region, wanted to evaluate PM10 and term low birth weight, that is full-term births that occurred after 37 weeks of gestation, but which were 5.5 pounds or less. And he looked at the period 1994 to 2000, excuse me, in Allegheny County, after controlling for other risk factors for low birth weight. And his objective was to use PM10 spatially and temporally generated with a sort of a spatial estimate of pollution. And he estimated PM10 levels corresponding to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd trimesters of pregnancy. He was able to use quarterly measures of PM10 in census tracts in Allegheny County that were actually determined, estimated from the RAND Center for 93 through 2000, and he didn't have the actual every exact month of quarterly PM10. He was able to determine quarterly levels, and so he would have to prorate the quarterly level depending on where the trimester began. But he in addition, took the quarterly levels from census tract and aggregated them to neighborhood and to municipality, if that was the case. The birth cohort was quite large. It was 100,000 singleton births available for Allegheny County between 94 and 2000. 92,447 were singleton births, and a total of 2,058 were actually term low birth weight infants, which occurred over the study period. This is lower than you would expect with the 8% that I mentioned nationally and locally, because these were term low birth weights. These were low births that occurred after the 37 weeks of gestation. Analysis, again, his endpoint was low birth weight, less than 5.5 grams, and gestational age that was term. He looked at these trimester-specific PM10 levels and was able to determine an average of exposure across trimesters. And of course, he considered the various risk factors for low birth weight that I've mentioned earlier. And this is just to show briefly that actually the robustness of his data set, because he was able to show what we expect, that age was actually related. Having a baby under the age of 20 was a risk factor for low birth weight, as well as over the age of 40. Maternal education has a relationship with, is well known, and so is smoking. Smoking has a very high risk factor for low birth weight. And he used, these are the percentiles of exposure that he determined based on his adding and his estimation of the levels. And you can see that for the trimesters 1, 2, and 3, based on the 50 percentiles, he was able to estimate the PM10 concentrations that he was going to be looking at, and then comparing 25.1 as the level at the lowest percentile, the lowest quartile, compared to the 75% quartile. So there was a 7 microgram difference between low exposure women and the women who lived in more high exposure areas, And his results were that odds ratios, that is the risk of having a low birth weight baby, per looking at the lowest quartile and the 75% quartile, showed a 13% increase for the first trimester of exposure and a 10% increase in the second trimester after adjusting for all of the various confounders that I mentioned earlier. Now we can fast forward to studies 2 and 3, which are the study population of preeclampsia that was conducted in 1997 through 2002. And this study actually took place at McGee Hospital. It was actually a study published by Jim Roberts from the McGee Hospital Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and was originally created not to look at air pollution, but to look at preeclampsia in women in Allegheny County. Pei-Chen Lee was able to acquire this information and do geocoding, and to go back and link the residents of the women when they came in for their clinic visits and enrolled in the study. And she was able to determine their air pollution levels and air pollution exposure during the first trimester, and then link it to air pollution exposure and blood pressure changes during pregnancy. Oh, thank you. So prenatal exposures and preeclampsia was the original study. It was 2,211 women. It was a prospective cohort recruited through McGee Hospital, healthy women aged 14 to 44 who enrolled in the study before 16 weeks of gestation. And the study was conducted between 1997 and 2001. And again, it was very similar to what Dr. Ezoo did, in that she was able to provide an estimate of PM10 and PM2.5 exposure, as well as carbon monoxide, SO2, ozone, and and also NO2 at the zip code level. She was only able to get PM2.5 for 1999 to 2001 because it hadn't really been collected prior to that time. And similar to data I'd shown you earlier, this population was very well represented in both the black and white communities. 60% of the women enrolled were Caucasian, and about 40% were African American. The interesting thing is, she had a pretty amazing dichotomy of smokers. About 30% were active smokers, 42% were passive, meaning they had somebody in their home that was smoking, and 25% were non-smokers. So again, this was 1997, and I believe I'm fairly sure the smoking rate among pregnant women is much lower now, but again, this was originally, the group was actually recruited in 1997 when the smoking rates were higher. These are again the descriptive air pollution readings, and you can see the 50th percentile, sort of the median exposure that was going on in Pittsburgh in 97 to 2001. PM 2.5 was about 15. I believe it's around 13 now, but it was 15 then. PM 10 was 24, ozone 30, and so on and so on. And you can see these are the lowest quartile, and then of course the first compared to the third, and then of course the very highest exposed group. And in this case, she was looking at birth weight, and she was looking at gestational weeks, but she was looking at something called C-reactive protein. And I believe it was mentioned earlier, C-reactive protein is one of the inflammatory markers that has been linked to heart disease risk, as well as inflammatory and immune responses to the lungs. A recent study, actually a week after Pei-Chan Lee defended, a study came out that actually showed that elevated CRP levels in early pregnancy were associated with lower fetal weight in the third trimester and an increased risk of small for gestational age offspring. CRP increases as gestational weeks increase, and low-grade inflammation during pregnancy has been related to preterm birth. The issue is, would you really see a difference in CRP by air pollution? And this is one of the things that she was able to try to look at. What she did was take those 2,211 women that then became a few hundred less because of missing data, and dichotomize the group into women who had less than 8 nanograms of milliliter of CRP versus greater than 8. And that was considered to be clinically the most relevant number. The dependent variable was, of course, CRP, and the independent variables were air pollution, and then the various other risk factors: maternal age, race, pregnancy history, BMI, maternal education, etc. And what she found was that PM 2.5 exposures were associated with increased CRP in early pregnancy, less than 22 weeks, and CO, SO2, NO2 were not associated with CRP. And the final result was that for every 5 micrograms of PM 2.5 averaged over 7 days before the blood draw, there was a 21% increase for high C-reactive protein. And her conclusion was that particulate pollution was related to elevated concentrations of a systemic inflammatory biomarker, which could affect their pregnancy. The third study in the Pittsburgh group was that of blood pressure. We know that pregnancy-induced hypertension contributes to complications in approximately 7 to 10% of all pregnancies in the United States, and a rise in systolic and diastolic blood pressure from early pregnancy to mid-trimester is associated with spontaneous preterm delivery. But no study to date had looked at air pollution and blood pressure changes during pregnancy. So Pei was able to use essentially the same PEPI study, the same preeclampsia group that was studied and recruited in 1997, and looked at the maternal blood pressure, including systolic and diastolic blood pressure, during each prenatal care visit. And these were abstracted from hospital records, as well as being taken at the time of a clinic visit. And basically, she followed the premise that she took the average of the two measures taken during the last prenatal care visit, minus the average of the blood pressure measurement in the first 20 weeks of gestation, and the blood pressure and the air pollution reading was taken at the same time, the same day, and during the same 2 weeks that the blood pressure reading was first taken when the women came in during the first to second trimester of their pregnancy. So she was looking at the blood pressure taken at the beginning of the clinic visit in the first 15 to 20 weeks that they entered the study, and the air pollution reading at the same time. And she adjusted for all the risk factors that we have mentioned. She looked at race, and she studied the entire population stratified by smoking. And what she found was that in effect, there was an effect overall for systolic blood pressure and in the population for PM10, but the biggest effect was really among non-smokers. There was a significant increase in millimeters of mercury for systolic blood pressure related to PM10. PM2.5 was not shown, but probably the reason was because the number of years that she had data for PM2.5 was much less. In the final paper, I'm running out of time here, but the final paper, I just found out about as I was reviewing the literature because it just came out. This was another birth outcome study, very similar to what Dr. Ezoo did, but in this case, she had ozone, PM10, and PM2.5, and she was able to look at preterm birth, intrauterine growth restriction, and gestational hypertension. And the results were that PM2.5, but not ozone, were associated with preeclampsia. Gestational hypertension was also significant for PM2.5 with an odds ratio of about 11% higher, depending on the interquartile range of exposure between high and low. And preterm delivery was also found to be significant for PM2.5 and ozone. So the data suggested that first trimester exposure to particles, mostly PM2.5 and ozone, may increase the risk of developing preeclampsia and gestational diabetes as well as preterm delivery. So our final conclusions are that air pollution at both the national and local levels, as studied in these investigations, have been shown to have a significant impact on adverse birth outcomes in the greater Pittsburgh area. These outcomes are associated with ambient levels currently still seen in Pittsburgh, and more research does need to be done on the effect of multiple pollutants as well as other air toxics not studied as extensively in the region, such as the hazardous air pollutants. And this is my grandson. This is the first day that he was on skates in Mount Lebanon, and it was just last week, so I thought I'd show the picture. So thank you very much.